The cruelest invitations are not the ones that ask you to come. They are the ones that remind you of everything you once believed was forever. Naomi Brooks stood by the narrow window of her brownstone apartment in Brooklyn as the late afternoon sun painted the city in shades of gold and amber. Outside, the streets carried on as they always did, taxis weaving through traffic, children laughing on the sidewalks, strangers rushing toward places that mattered only to them. But inside her quiet home, time seemed to stop the moment she noticed the ivory envelope resting against her front door. It was elegant, impossibly elegant, the kind of stationery reserved for people whose names appeared in business magazines and charity galas. Her fingers hesitated before she picked it up. The thick paper felt expensive, almost heavy, as though it carried more than words inside. In the upper left corner, embossed in silver, were two names that instantly stole the air from her lungs: Ethan Crawford and Victoria Sinclair. She did not need to open it to know what it was. 5 years had passed since she had last seen Ethan. 5 long years since the man she had loved with every quiet corner of her heart had looked at ambition and decided it mattered more than loyalty. She had spent those years rebuilding herself piece by piece, learning that some storms do not destroy you. They reveal who you were always meant to become. Still, her hands trembled as she unfolded the invitation. The silver lettering shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. Together with their families, Ethan Crawford and Victoria Sinclair request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. Naomi stared at the words until they blurred. Then something small slipped from the envelope and landed softly against the hardwood floor. A handwritten card. She knew the handwriting before she even picked it up. Ethan's letters had always leaned slightly to the right, careful and controlled, just like the man himself. She turned the card over. I hope you come, so you can finally see what you lost. The silence inside the apartment grew heavier than the words themselves. She could still remember another version of that. Handwriting, scribbled across coffee shop napkins and old notebooks years ago when Ethan was nothing more than a young man with impossible dreams and a second-hand suit. Back then, they believed love could outwork poverty. Back then, they believed loyalty was enough. Naomi closed her eyes for only a moment. The memories arrived without permission. The tiny apartment they once shared. The old piano music drifting through open windows during summer nights. The silver ring he had bought from a pawn shop because it was all he could afford. He had smiled when he placed it in her hand and whispered that one day he would replace it with something worthy of her. She never cared about the ring. She only cared about the man. A quiet breeze slipped through the half-open window, carrying the distant sounds of the city below. Naomi walked toward the bookshelf in the corner of the room and opened a small wooden box hidden behind a row of old novels. Inside, wrapped in soft white cloth, rested that same silver ring. She had not touched it in years. The metal had dulled with time, but somehow it still held the warmth of a promise that had never been kept. She looked down at the invitation in one hand and the ring in the other. Then, for the first time since the envelope had arrived, a faint smile touched her face. It was not the smile of a woman planning revenge. It was the smile of someone who had survived the very thing that was supposed to break her. Somewhere across Manhattan, crystal chandeliers were being polished for the wedding of the year. The newspapers would call it the union of two powerful families. The television cameras would capture every perfect detail. But none of them knew that a simple envelope had just awakened a story buried beneath 5 years of silence. And none of them could imagine that the woman they expected to humiliate had already become someone they would never be able to forget. 5 years earlier, long before magazine covers and billion-dollar headlines carried Ethan Crawford's name, there had only been a tiny apartment above an old bookstore in Brooklyn where the ceiling leaked every time it rained and the heat worked only when it wanted to. Naomi used to joke that the place had character. Ethan used to call it temporary. Every evening after finishing her shift at the neighborhood community center, she would climb 3 flights of narrow stairs carrying groceries in one hand and a stack of library books in the other. Ethan would already be there, sitting at the small kitchen table surrounded by pages of business plans, market reports, and handwritten notes that seemed far too ambitious for a man with barely enough money to pay next month's rent. He always looked up the moment she opened the door. The worry would leave his face, replaced by the quiet smile that made the whole room feel warmer than it really was. They did not have expensive dinners or luxury vacations. Friday nights meant sharing one large pizza, because it was cheaper than ordering 2 small ones. Sunday afternoons meant walking through Central Park with coffee and paper cups, dreaming about a future that seemed impossible to everyone except them. Ethan talked about building a company that would change lives. Naomi listened as though he was already the man the world would one day admire. When doubt crept into his voice, she erased it before it could grow. She reminded him that every great story began with someone willing to believe before anyone else did. Sometimes he would laugh and tell her that she believed enough for both of them. The old piano bar on Lexington Avenue became their favorite place because the owner let them sit in the back without ordering anything more than 2 glasses of iced tea. They would listen to the music for hours while Ethan sketched ideas on napkins and Naomi organized his thoughts into something that actually made sense. She had a gift for seeing patterns, for turning scattered dreams into plans that could survive the real world. One rainy evening, he pushed a folded piece of paper across the table. It was the first business proposal he had ever finished. At the bottom, beneath his own signature, he had written a single line. Built with Naomi. She laughed and told him that one day he would need lawyers to write documents instead of coffee-stained napkins. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. "I will never forget who helped me build this," he whispered. Years later, those words would echo louder than he ever intended. On the night he received the phone call that changed everything, they stood on the roof of their apartment building watching the city lights shimmer beneath the stars. A major investor had agreed to meet him. It was the opportunity he had spent years chasing. Ethan could barely speak through the excitement. Naomi simply wrapped her arms around him and looked toward the skyline. She could already see the future he dreamed about. What she could not see was the distance success would place between them. The wind lifted a loose strand of her dark curls as Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring. It was not perfect. The edges were slightly worn, and the stone was no larger than a drop of rain. He slid it gently into her palm instead of onto her finger. "Keep this for now," he said softly. "One day I will give you the life you deserve." Naomi closed her fingers around the ring and smiled at the man standing beside her. She never asked for a bigger promise. She believed that love itself was already enough. The meeting with the investors took place on the 52nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Manhattan, a world that seemed impossibly far from the little apartment where Ethan and Naomi had built their dreams. Ethan wore the only tailored suit he owned, adjusting the sleeves every few seconds as though confidence could be stitched into the fabric. Naomi stood beside him in a simple navy dress, holding the leather folder that contained months of research, projections, and handwritten notes they had created together. When the elevator doors opened, polished marble floors and crystal lights reflected a future neither of them had ever touched before. The presentation lasted less than an hour, but for Ethan it felt like the beginning of a new life. The investors listened carefully, asked difficult questions, and every time his voice started to shake, his eyes found Naomi sitting quietly near the window. She would give him the smallest nod, and somehow the right words always returned. At the end of the meeting, a silver-haired executive named Richard Sinclair stood and offered Ethan his hand. "Welcome to a much bigger world, Mr. Crawford. We believe you have something special." The deal changed everything almost overnight. New offices replaced the old apartment. Business dinners replaced evenings at the piano bar. Calls came at midnight. Flights left before sunrise. Naomi told herself that sacrifice was part of building a future together. She decorated the new office with framed photographs from their early days and placed the old business proposal labeled "Built" with Naomi inside Ethan's desk drawer for good luck. But slowly the spaces between them began to grow. Ethan stopped taking the subway because drivers waited downstairs. He stopped carrying notebooks because assistants organized his schedule. Sometimes he came home after midnight, exhausted and distant, speaking more about shareholders than dreams. Naomi never complained. She would heat his dinner, ask about his day, and remind him to rest. One evening she arrived at the office carrying coffee for both of them. The reception area was larger than their entire first apartment. Employees hurried through the lobby wearing expensive suits, speaking into wireless headsets. A young woman with flawless blonde hair stepped forward before Naomi reached the elevators. "I am sorry. Do you have an appointment?" she asked politely. Naomi smiled. "I am here to see Ethan." The woman looked down at her tablet. "Mr. Crawford is in a meeting with Miss Victoria Sinclair. It may take several hours." Naomi thanked her and quietly left the coffee at the front desk. She did not know who Victoria Sinclair was. A week later, her answer appeared across the business section of every newspaper in New York. Richard Sinclair's daughter had officially joined Crawford Global as Vice President of Strategic Development. The photograph showed Victoria standing beside Ethan during a charity gala, both of them smiling beneath a sea of camera flashes. Naomi studied the picture longer than she wanted to admit. Ethan called later that night and laughed when she mentioned it. "She is just part of the company now," he said. "This is how business works. You worry too much." Naomi wanted to believe him because love had always asked her to trust before questioning. Yet something had changed inside the photograph. Ethan's smile looked polished instead of genuine, and the city that once belonged to both of them suddenly seemed to belong only to him. She opened the small wooden box beside her bed and looked at the old silver ring resting inside. The metal had not changed, but somehow the promise it carried felt farther away than the stars above Manhattan. Autumn arrived quietly, covering Manhattan in shades of copper and gold, but the warmth that once lived between Naomi and Ethan seemed to disappear with the changing leaves. Crawford Global was expanding faster than anyone had imagined. Newspapers called Ethan the youngest visionary on Wall Street. Television hosts praised his intelligence and discipline. Every success filled Naomi with pride, yet every headline seemed to carry him a little farther away from the man who had once shared cold pizza and impossible dreams with her. Their apartment, once alive with conversations and laughter, had become a place where silence waited by the door. Ethan was always traveling now. Boston one week, Chicago the next, California after that. His suitcase barely had time to touch the floor before another assistant arrived with a new itinerary. Naomi learned to celebrate milestones alone. She placed a small chocolate cake on the kitchen table the night Crawford Global opened its second office. She lit a single candle and waited. Midnight came and went. Her phone finally buzzed just after 1 a.m. "I am sorry. The meeting ran late. I will make it up to you." She smiled at the message, even though tears quietly gathered in her eyes. The next morning, she carried the untouched cake to the trash. A few weeks later, Ethan invited her to attend the annual Sinclair Foundation Gala. He promised it would be different this time. "We will leave early," he said. "Just you and me. Like old times." Naomi wore a simple black dress and the silver ring hidden beneath a delicate chain around her neck. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, every table decorated with white roses and golden candles. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in elegant gowns moved through the room with effortless confidence. Naomi felt out of place, but Ethan squeezed her hand as they entered. For one brief moment, she believed they would find each other again. Then Richard Sinclair stepped onto the stage. The room grew quiet as he welcomed the guests and spoke about the future of American business. At the end of his speech, he smiled toward the front row. "There is one more person I would like to recognize tonight. My daughter, Victoria Sinclair, whose leadership has become an essential part of Crawford Global's success." Applause filled the ballroom as Victoria walked onto the stage. She wore a silver gown that sparkled beneath the lights, and when she reached Ethan, Richard gently guided him beside her for the photographers. Camera flashes exploded across the room. Richard placed one hand on Ethan's shoulder and the other on Victoria's. Together, they looked less like business partners and more like the future king and queen of a corporate empire. Naomi stood alone near the back of the ballroom. No one noticed that Ethan had stepped away from her. No one noticed the woman who had believed in him before the world ever did. She watched the cameras capture a story that did not include her. Then she heard it. Two women standing nearby whispered softly, believing she was too far away to listen. "They make such a beautiful couple. I heard the families are already discussing a wedding." Naomi did not cry. She simply reached beneath her dress, closed her fingers around the old silver ring, and walked out into the cool October night. Behind her, the music continued, the crystal lights still shining as though nothing had changed. But somewhere between the ballroom doors and the empty streets of Manhattan, the woman who had spent years protecting Ethan's dream realized she might be the only one still holding on to it. Winter arrived early that year, wrapping New York City in a cold silence that seemed to settle inside Naomi's heart. She did not ask Ethan about the whispers she had heard at the gala, and he did not mention them either. They moved through the same apartment like strangers borrowing the same space, speaking only about schedules, meetings, and ordinary things that required no feelings. Sometimes Naomi would wake before sunrise and find his side of the bed untouched, his pillow still perfectly smooth. The city had given him everything he had ever wanted, and little by little it was taking him away from her. One gray afternoon, as snow drifted softly outside her office window at the community center, Naomi received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. "Miss Brooks, this is Amanda Lewis from Crawford Global. Mr. Crawford would like you to join him for dinner tonight. It has been arranged at 7 o'clock. Naomi almost smiled. It had been months since Ethan had planned anything for the two of them. She left work early and walked home through streets covered in fresh snow, wondering if perhaps they had finally reached the end of whatever invisible wall had grown between them. She chose the dark blue dress Ethan once said reminded him of the evening sky and slipped the silver ring back onto its chain around her neck. When she arrived at the restaurant, the hostess greeted her politely but with a trace of confusion. "I am sorry, ma'am. The private room upstairs is reserved for the Crawford and Sinclair families." Naomi felt the air leave her lungs. There had to be some mistake. She showed the text message from Ethan's assistant. The hostess apologized and asked her to wait while she checked. As Naomi stood near the entrance, the grand staircase overlooking the dining room filled with laughter. She looked up without thinking. Ethan was there. Beside him stood Victoria Sinclair, her hand resting lightly on his arm as photographers captured another perfect moment. Around them, members of both families raised glasses in celebration. A banner decorated with white flowers hung against the far wall. "Congratulations to Ethan and Victoria." Naomi stared at the words, unable to move. One of the photographers asked them to stand closer together. Richard Sinclair placed a small velvet box into Ethan's hand, and the entire room applauded. She did not need to see what was inside. She already knew. Ethan looked toward the entrance just as the hostess returned. For a brief second their eyes met across the crowded room. Surprise crossed his face, followed quickly by something harder to understand. Guilt perhaps, or fear. Naomi did not wait to find out. She quietly removed the silver chain from around her neck and closed her hand around the old ring. Then she turned and walked back into the falling snow. She did not cry on the taxi ride home. She did not throw away the photographs or pack her things in anger. Instead, she opened the small wooden box beside her bed, placed the ring inside, and closed the lid for what she believed would be the last time. Across the city, crystal glasses continued to rise beneath warm golden lights, celebrating a future built on ambition. But in the quiet stillness of a small Brooklyn apartment, another future had just been born, one that would ask Naomi Brooks to discover who she was without the man she had spent years helping the world admire. The morning after Naomi closed the wooden box, she packed a single suitcase and left Brooklyn before the city had fully awakened. There was no dramatic farewell, no angry message waiting on Ethan's phone, no desperate attempt to make him understand what he had lost. The apartment that had once held their dreams remained exactly as it was, quiet and untouched, as though love itself had simply stepped outside for a moment and forgotten the way back. Atlanta became her new beginning. A former colleague from the community center had invited her to help organize a small financial literacy program for families struggling to rebuild after difficult times. The office was nothing more than 3 borrowed rooms above an old neighborhood library, with faded walls and secondhand furniture, but the people who walked through those doors carried something Naomi understood very well. They carried hope that had been broken but not destroyed. During the day, she taught young entrepreneurs how to write business plans and manage small budgets. At night, she sat alone beneath the soft glow of a desk lamp, reviewing applications from local business owners who had been turned away by banks and investors. The work reminded her of another young dreamer who had once spread handwritten notes across a tiny kitchen table. Only this time, she was helping hundreds of them instead of one. Months passed, then years. The little program slowly became a nonprofit foundation. The foundation became an investment network. Donations turned into partnerships, and partnerships grew into opportunities for communities that larger corporations had forgotten. Naomi never chased recognition. She simply kept saying yes whenever someone needed help standing back up. One spring afternoon, an elderly businessman named Walter Hayes visited the foundation. He had spent 40 years building one of the largest private investment groups in the Southeast before retiring. He quietly watched Naomi speak to a room full of young business owners, encouraging them to believe in themselves long before the world noticed them. When the presentation ended, Walter approached her with tears resting gently in his eyes. "You do not build companies, Miss Brooks," he said softly. "You build people. I have spent my whole life looking for someone who understands the difference." Within a year, Walter invited Naomi to become a partner in his investment group. She accepted only after making him promise that every project would continue serving neighborhoods and small businesses that others ignored. Together, they transformed the company into something entirely new, proving that success and kindness did not have to live on opposite sides of the same table. Newspapers eventually discovered the story of the quiet woman, helping revive struggling communities across America. Magazine covers called her the woman changing the future of ethical investing. Television hosts praised her vision and compassion. Yet every evening, after the meetings and interviews had ended, Naomi returned home to a simple brownstone, made herself a cup of tea, and placed the old wooden box on the bookshelf beside her favorite novels. She never opened it anymore. She no longer needed to. The silver ring inside had stopped being a promise of what might have been. It had become a reminder of the woman she used to be. One warm afternoon, almost 5 years after she had walked away from that restaurant in the snow, her assistant entered the office carrying an elegant ivory envelope edged in silver. "I almost threw it away because I thought it looked personal," the young woman said with an apologetic smile. Naomi thanked her and waited until the office was empty before opening it. The moment she saw the familiar handwriting across the small card hidden inside, the room grew perfectly still. "I hope you come, so you can finally see what you lost." Naomi looked through the window at the skyline beyond her office. The city below was alive with movement, but her reflection remained calm. Then, for the first time in many years, she walked to the bookshelf, reached for the old wooden box, and gently lifted the lid. The wedding was scheduled for the first Saturday in May at the Grand Lexington Hotel, a place where presidents, celebrities, and billionaires celebrated the moments they wanted the world to remember forever. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings nearly 30 feet high, reflecting thousands of tiny lights across polished marble floors. White roses lined the entrance, and reporters had already gathered outside hours before the ceremony, eager to capture what magazines were calling the social event of the year. Naomi arrived in New York the evening before, not because she wanted to relive the past, but because she had learned that some chapters only end when you are brave enough to read the final page. Her assistant had reserved a quiet suite overlooking Central Park, but she spent most of the night standing by the window, watching the city she had once called home. It looked exactly the same, yet she realized she was no longer the woman who had left with a single suitcase and a broken heart. Early the next morning, Walter Hayes knocked softly on her door. He carried a long black garment bag and a small velvet box. "I thought you might need these," he said with a gentle smile. Naomi opened the garment bag and found an elegant gown the color of deep red wine, simple but timeless, designed with the kind of quiet grace that never needed to demand attention. The velvet box held a delicate pair of diamond earrings that had once belonged to Walter's late wife. She believed beautiful things should remind people of strength, not status, he told her. Naomi looked at the gifts for a long moment before accepting them. "Thank you," she whispered. Around noon, a black Rolls-Royce stopped in front of the hotel. Security guards stepped aside as photographers turned their cameras toward the arriving guests. Politicians, athletes, corporate leaders. Then the rear door opened, and the entire entrance seemed to fall silent. Naomi stepped onto the red carpet with calm, measured confidence. The soft spring sunlight touched the rich color of her gown, making it glow against the white marble steps. Her hair rested gently across her shoulders, and the diamond earrings caught the light with every movement. She was not trying to outshine anyone. She simply looked like a woman who had learned to carry her own story with dignity. Walter stepped out beside her, offering his arm. The cameras immediately began flashing. A few reporters whispered her name, uncertain where they had seen her before. Then someone recognized her from the cover of a national business magazine. Another voice followed. "That is Naomi Brooks, the founder of the Hayes Community Investment Network, the woman who rebuilt hundreds of small businesses across the country." The whispers spread through the crowd like a quiet wave. Inside the ballroom, Victoria stood near the grand staircase reviewing the final details when one of her friends hurried over, her face pale with surprise. "There is someone here you should see." Ethan looked toward the entrance at the exact moment the ballroom doors opened. Time seemed to slow. The music faded into the distance. 5 years disappeared between one heartbeat and the next. Naomi walked beneath the crystal lights with the same quiet grace she had carried all those years ago, but something had changed. She no longer looked like the woman he had left behind. She looked like someone who had built an entirely new world without him. And for the first time since he became the man everyone admired, Ethan Crawford felt as though he was standing in front of the one success that money could never buy back. The ballroom slowly came back to life, but something invisible had shifted beneath the crystal lights. Conversations became quieter. Guests who had arrived expecting to celebrate the perfect union between two powerful families now found themselves watching the woman who carried herself with a kind of confidence that could never be purchased. Naomi greeted old acquaintances with warmth and grace, never once looking as though she had come to prove anything. Walter Hayes introduced her to governors, philanthropists, and business leaders from across the country, and each introduction seemed to deepen the quiet astonishment spreading through the room. Ethan remained near the grand staircase, answering questions he barely heard. His eyes kept finding Naomi no matter where she stood. He remembered the young woman who had organized his scattered ideas on coffee-stained napkins, the one who had believed in him before investors, reporters, and shareholders ever knew his name. He had spent years convincing himself that leaving her had been the price of building an empire. Yet standing beneath those lights, watching her smile at strangers with the same kindness she had once reserved for him, he felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. Regret. Victoria noticed it immediately. She had spent years learning how to read people, and she understood that the expression on Ethan's face had nothing to do with surprise. It was loss. She walked toward Naomi with practiced elegance, her silver gown catching the light with every step. The nearby conversations faded as guests quietly turned to watch the meeting between the two women. Victoria offered a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I have heard so much about you," she said softly. Naomi returned the smile with effortless calm. "I hope only the good parts." A few people laughed quietly, easing the tension for a moment. Victoria glanced toward Walter Hayes. "I did not realize you and Mr. Hayes worked together." Walter answered before Naomi could speak. "I do not work with Miss Brooks. I work for her vision. She simply allows me to help." The words landed in the room with unexpected weight. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. One of them quietly explained to another that Naomi's organization had recently become one of the fastest-growing investment groups in the country, managing projects that were transforming communities across multiple states. Ethan had not known. He stared at Naomi as though seeing her for the first time. Before he could walk toward her, an elderly man in a dark suit approached carrying a leather document case. It was Michael Grant, the attorney who had represented Crawford Global during its earliest days. "Ethan, I have been trying to find you all afternoon," he said. "There is something that belonged to you, but I believe you were never meant to receive it until now." Confused, Ethan accepted the old envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in handwriting he knew better than his own, were the words, "For Ethan, when he no longer doubts himself." His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside was a copy of a property sale agreement dated 5 years earlier. Naomi Brooks had sold the small house her late mother left her. Attached to the contract was a cashier's check made out to Crawford Global Holdings, the exact amount the company had needed to survive its first financial crisis. At the bottom was a short handwritten note. "Dreams deserve one more chance. Do not tell him. Let him believe he saved himself." The music continued to play beneath the chandeliers, but for Ethan the world had gone completely silent. Everything he had built suddenly rested on a sacrifice he had never known existed, and the woman he had invited to witness his greatest triumph had unknowingly become the quiet foundation beneath it all. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood beneath the crystal chandeliers with the old letter trembling in his hands. Around him, the orchestra continued to play. Servers moved quietly between tables, and guests whispered about the unexpected revelation that had unfolded before their eyes. But none of it reached him anymore. All he could see was a small apartment above an old bookstore, a young woman carrying groceries after work, and a coffee-stained business plan with the words "Built with Naomi" written across the bottom. He had spent years believing he had climbed to the top by strength alone, never knowing that when his dream had stood on the edge of collapse, someone else had quietly given up the last piece of her own future to save it. Victoria looked at the letter, then back at Ethan. The expression on his face told her everything she needed to know. She had competed against many people in business, but she realized she could never compete with a memory built on sacrifice. Without anger or tears, she slowly removed the engagement ring from her hand and placed it gently on a nearby table. "I think," she said softly, "there was always someone else standing beside you." The ballroom fell silent as she turned and walked away. No one tried to stop her. Ethan looked toward the entrance just in time to see Naomi quietly thanking Walter Hayes before making her way toward the doors. She had not come to destroy a wedding. She had not spoken a single cruel word. She had simply shown up exactly as she was, and somehow that had been enough to reveal every truth hidden beneath the glittering surface of the evening. Ethan hurried after her, leaving behind the cameras, the flowers, and the carefully planned future that suddenly felt empty. Outside, the warm spring air carried the distant sounds of the city. Naomi stood beside the black Rolls-Royce, looking toward the skyline that had once broken her heart and somehow helped rebuild it. Ethan stopped a few feet away. For the first time in years, he had no speech prepared, no investors to impress, no strategy to hide behind. He reached into his pocket and slowly placed the old silver ring into the palm of his hand. Michael Grant had found it years ago inside the wooden box Naomi left behind in the apartment and had quietly kept it, believing one day its story would need an ending. Ethan held it out to her. "I was so busy chasing the life I thought I wanted that I never saw the person who gave it to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi looked down at the little ring. Time had worn away its shine, but not its meaning. She gently closed Ethan's fingers around it and offered him the same quiet smile she had carried all evening. "You did not lose me today, Ethan," she said softly. "You lost me the day you stopped believing that love was enough." A single tear slipped down his face, but Naomi did not step away in anger. She simply reached out and straightened the collar of his jacket the way she used to before important meetings long ago. "Some people come into our lives to help us become who we are meant to be," she continued. "That does not always mean they are meant to stay forever." Walter opened the car door, waiting patiently. Naomi gave Ethan one final look, filled not with bitterness but with peace. Then she stepped into the car, and it slowly disappeared into the lights of the city. Ethan remained standing on the quiet street, the old silver ring resting in his hand as the first light of dawn touched the skyline. He had built an empire, but the greatest gift he had ever been given had never asked for money, power, or recognition. It had only asked to be loved. And sometimes, the deepest form of justice is not watching someone fall. It is becoming the kind of person their betrayal could never destroy.